To order. First item is Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'm going to go ahead and call the Marathon County Joint Infrastructure Committee and Human Resources Finance Property Committee to order from the infrastructure side, and we have a quorum present. Supervisor Jensen is excused.
And we have two members absent, Supervisor Reynolds and Supervisor Marshall. Both are excused, and Chair Gibbs is participating remotely from HR Finance. The rest of the committee is here. So the public comments, nobody has approached either the clerk or myself.
And no one has approached me as well.
We'll move on to item 4A, overview of the highway.
If I may, if I interrupt, I wanted to make a request if we could put F first in the discussion, because the primary reason why we were getting together was to talk about the wheel registration, wheel tax, the vehicle registration fee. And I was wondering if that would be appropriate, that we could move that up first in the discussion. Thank you.
Well, it's not the primary purpose, but it is one of the purposes. And is there an objection?
I would prefer that we keep the order as is, because what we've got on the agenda in terms of looking at the highway fund balance, I think that's relevant to our future discussion of the vehicle registration fee.
And if I may, another reason is there's potential action to be taken even before we discuss the wheel tax, the vehicle registration fee. And so I don't understand how we would be having potential action on moving money out of funds without even a discussion of the vehicle registration fee.
Randy,
I'd prefer to keep it as is. If we want to delay action on a certain item, we can do so. But there's a lot of different moving pieces to this, I agree, but I'd like to keep it as is.
All right, then the first item would be 4A, overview of past efforts and planning related to the Highway Department Wausau shop relocation.
All right, and staff are here to kind of give you an overview, although we will strive to be brief, as I know each of these committees received significant presentations relative to the past efforts and planning relative to highway shop relocation. You'll see item 4A1 also does get to the idea of fund balances, and I'll hand out a document just to work off of, but that too will be at a very high level. But with this, I'll kick it over to Jim to start, and I will chime in throughout.
Thank you, Lance. As Lance mentioned, we've seen a couple of these presentations already, so I will keep it brief as possible. As I had mentioned previously, that we have gone through 7 different studies of this possible relocation of the site, including using our existing site that we have right now. Our existing site, just for a recap, we've been here since about the mid-30s. It served us well back in the day, but we have simply just have outgrown this facility. I had my shop supervisor run a report today on how many pieces of equipment, and granted, when I say pieces of equipment, that includes when we have a truck with an underbody and a wing. Each one of those components are separate. But we have 323 parts or different pieces of equipment at our existing facility. So we've just outgrown this. Another concern I have is every night we come in, and if we're out plowing till 10, 11 o'clock at night, the plows come in, they have to remove their plows, come in, let the truck unthaw a little bit, 4 o'clock in the morning, put their plows back on. So we do run the risk of injury out there also at all times. The existing site is made up with a lot of different buildings. Again, the building number 5 to the left, that was our existing building. Building number 12, for example, that was moved in from Elderon in the early 90s. Building number 9, if you remember when we used to have the bus, library bus, that was the home of the library bus. So we have a lot of different places making this up. In 2016, we did our first study. It was a space analysis, and we came up with we needed 240,000 square feet. Once we get to our proposed building, the latest version, we're actually down to 222. We have cut that down in size. Again, this was back in 2016, and you'll see the cost in 2016 facility that is bigger than we have proposed was $27,513,000. So you can see, you'll be able to see how much the cost of these sites have risen through the years. After we did our first one, we went back to the drawing board, and there was some thought process about combining highway department, maintenance, building, parks, and sheriff maintenance all together into a facility. So we took a look at that. As you all know now that a lot of people have found different sites, so we kept going through different types of studies. We've looked at our first site selection study, included looking at 14 different sites through the Wausau area. We want to be near 51, 29 interchange. We want to have sewer and water. So those are kind of the big things. We could find land cheaper farther out, but we need to make sure that we have that sewer and water. A couple sites did rise to the top at that point. The Witter Farms north of Wausau in the village of Maine. They had 2 sites that worked great for us. However, back at that time, it was brought to the board and no movement was ever made. So we went back in 2020, we did another study, and we added emergency management to it. And we looked at a couple different sites again. And one other site came up at that point, out by the industrial park off of Satine Drive and 72nd. So we took a look at that site as well. And at that point, the building was up to the 76 to $80 million range. 2022, we looked at a couple more sites, and we came back and I got back up one. We did look at that site. At that point, the Village of Maine decided that they would not change the zoning for us. So those sites in the Village of Maine were eliminated from consideration at that point. So we moved on and looked at a couple more sites. In our next study, we looked at some out in Satine and Rib Mountain. The same one in Satine, but we looked at coming in off of 72nd. The sites began getting up to the $85 million range for the combination sites. The Rib Mountain site became unavailable because they were not going to change the zoning out there. That has become residential at this point. And the town of Satine site was purchased time we got there. Nope, got a couple more. 23, we looked at one more site out in the town, in the village of Weston. Again, that was a combination site. And after speaking with the administration out there, they would also not consider changing their zoning. So we kind of went back to the drawing board at that point and said, maybe we need to just do highway alone, because the other zoning, CPZ, they were moving. We found a place for emergency management. So at that point, the decision was made, let's just go back to highway. So we did take a look at our existing site again at that point. And the cost on this one shows $51 million. That does not include the Mosinee site. What's happening in Mosinee due to the airport and FAA new regulations, we need to close and move down our Mosinee satellite shop. So if we need to move that, we're probably looking at a $6 or $7 additional cost. Plus, after speaking to our own facility development management and spoke to representatives from Myron, on this $51 million cost, they only use a 5% contingency, which is a good number to use if you're billing from a clean sheet of paper. But if you watch any of the home improvement channels, every time they start a project, they always find something that's wrong with it. Everybody that I had spoke to said you need to use a 10% contingency instead of a 5% contingency. So the total construction costs actually risen to about $62 million to stay at our existing facility. You got her.
All right, I'm pinch hitting for Sam to talk through financing as she's at a GFOA, or Government Finance Officers Association conference, which is good. She's learning a lot of things about, one of them is highway and audit preparedness. But I'll go relatively quickly through some of these debt financing slides. A lot of this should be very familiar. It was in the budget. But just to back up to what Jim talked about, this has been talked about, this idea of relocating the highway shop for as long as I've been in administration. I go back to 2016. And the underlying message has been one of, let's be very strategic and thoughtful. And initially that strategic and thoughtfulness was about consolidating sites. And it not only was, as Jim said, it started with Parks, Rec, and Forestry and Sheriff's Maintenance. It also looked at potentially sharing some of those facilities with the city of Wausau in terms of wash bays and other things. That morphed from that initial version to add, as Jim said, emergency management and conservation planning and zoning, with the overall idea always being, how can we look at all of our facilities as a county more strategically to minimize long-term operational costs. As all of you know, we're wrapping up a big part of that effort with our Lakeview campus work, where we are having a lot of those departments that Jim referenced, conservation planning and zoning most notably, emergency management, Parks, Rec, and Forestry. We have a plan now to divest ourselves or redevelop those sites, the standalone sites, River Drive buildings, the Thomas Street buildings. So we no longer need to pursue, as Jim alluded to, this highway department site co-located with Parks, Rec, and Forestry or emergency management. So really moving back to a highway department only site makes sense, but there is still a thoughtfulness operational component here, and that is, as Jim alluded to, let's look at all the highway facilities, all of our satellite shops, including our Mosinee shop, which we need to relocate at some point based on that guidance from the, or directives from the FAA. And I think, as we've talked about, there is an opportunity to do that with the Wausau shop that, as Jim referenced, just really no longer fits our current needs, but certainly long-term. If you think about where's the next 15, 20, 35 years, it presents real challenge to stay there, but also then how can we do that work with the Mosinee shop? So I want to move forward with the discussion about debt and potential financing of the highway facility, with building off the number that Jim referenced on page 21 of the packet. Right now it shows essentially 52 million, but for the reasons Jim referenced, perhaps a better number when you get further into this is going to be in that $62 million range. Nevertheless, we can talk about what that looks like when we look at a co-located between Mosinee and the Wausau shop, what a future site looks like. I'm going to probably be using the number of 59 million as I talk through what our plan was, because going back a number of months, that's the number we talked about with our financial advisor. So just to start with, again, the status of our current debt, and I'll go through this relatively quickly. It is within your the annual budget document you looked at. You can see the summary debt schedule here. But really the probably the easiest way to look at this is this slide 25. This was put together by PFM before your annual budget adoption. So there's a little bit of a tweak that I'll walk us through what it would look like a little differently. Your historical debt service last year, or this year I should say, was $2.553 million. Now with the modifications you made in adopting your annual 2025 budget, the debt service amount is going to be closer to 2.3 million. So it is dropped a little bit, but nevertheless, the overall idea you see here in terms of what your future debt service looks like is generally consistent. You'll see that there is an anticipation of that debt service needing to utilize less debt levy coming up in 2032 when those debt schedules start to change. In terms of mill rate, again, not overly important for the discussion here, but you'll likewise see that same sort of drop in mill rate based on the projections that PFM had, including your general growth in equalized value and what that would play out in terms of mill rate. So the work that PFM did was essentially saying, looking at what, and maybe now is a good time, if I can steal that sheet there, a good time to talk about the sheet I handed out on fund balance. But the idea was utilize some fund balance, a significant portion of fund balance, to mitigate the need to borrow. Now, the cost of the highway facilities that Jim's talking about, again, just if we use that $59 million number, you don't have enough in fund balance to finance that whole highway shop with essentially reserves, but you do have a significant portion, which you discussed during the budget adoption and was in the memo that Sam put together. And really the document I just handed out is, if for Chair Gibbs, I know you're attending virtually, essentially very similar to that corrected memo that was circulated previously, I believe on the 13th of November was the corrected version. But essentially you have, when we go through and we operate off of that $42 million remaining unassigned balance from the highway fund balance, as noted in your year-end financials at the end of 2023 through the audit. And then you start to tick off from that 42 million the other expenditures that were adopted by the board through your annual 2024 budget or amendments to that budget and your adopted 2025 budget and the projects that we talked about at infrastructure where Jim has applied for those state match projects, and you take the county required match out of there, that's that subtotal of about $13 million that I talked about from on that fund balance sheet. So you have 42 million, take off 13-ish million. It really leaves you with a balance that then you can talk about how much do you want to assign, if any, if you're going to relocate the highway shop. That is a policy question for the board. If you're going to essentially assign, and what assign means, just to clarify whether or not it's moving money, you're technically not moving money with an assignment, and a committee can make an assignment. If you go back to that memo that Sam drafted, there's a difference between committed and assigned within general audit speak. But a commitment is something that takes the act of a formal resolution through a board. Assignment, standing committees, if they have the authority to do so, can have an assignment. It doesn't technically move money, but it simply says by action of that standing committee that you essentially have a plan. This is my characterization. You have a plan with which to use those funds. So once you decide what the direction that, once this committee and ultimately the board decides what that future direction is relative to highway relocation, you can make a decision about assignment. And just for purposes of discussion, and I talked through with Sam this idea earlier today, even if you assign $30 million toward the highway shop of your existing fund balance, when you go through that math, that would leave you in a deficit in the the remaining unassigned of just shy of $1 million. I had the conversation with Sam. We don't have concerns about that because you still have working capital, but it's really just for purposes of conversation today off of that sheet that, whether you assign any funds or whether it's 26 million to 30, just for purposes of conversation, it can go back to the PowerPoint slides that were in your packet. They were developed with the idea that $26 million of a $56 million project would be utilized from highway fund balance. So at the end of the day, in that scenario, you're borrowing $30 million. So let's talk about financing a highway relocation with the understanding that about half of the cost of a $59 million building or $60 million building, half of it is funded through reserves, and half of it would be funded then through borrowing, specifically bonding. And that is what PFM put together in terms of if you would issue notes in 2027, that's what slide 30 is. You issue those notes. What would that look like in terms of debt service impact given your current levels of debt service? Now, again, going to slide 31, the debt service in the graph that PFM put together for us several months ago is a bit different because of the adopted budget from 2025. But you'll nevertheless see the overall picture you have is there's a path forward where if you utilize a significant amount of fund balance, you can essentially level out that debt service so you don't have a significant increase in tax rate. Because as PFM put in the presentation and I made to each of you previously, if you, as any municipal government, if you go out and you borrow $30 million, absent a monumental increase in equalized value, which quite frankly none of us want, we don't want everyone's home values to be inflated substantially in any one year, you're going to have an increase in your debt levy rate. But with the debt levy, as demonstrated in these slides, that there is that reduction coming in 2032 with your current debt service needs, you can work with PFM. I think there's a way to do this in terms of issuing debt. If you utilize fund balance in a significant way to limit the need to borrow, you can work a way to keep that relatively flat. That is the underlying idea that I think the PFM information shares. Again, we need to update these numbers in light of the adopted budget with the reduction in debt levy that was approved by the board. But overall, that is the idea, the opportunity that is before ultimately the board, should you wish to move forward with a highway relocation. If you don't, I think that is a different question. I think to Vice Chair Dickinson's point, this is how the vehicle registration fee and fund balance pieces are intermingled. It's a chicken or egg, right? You have to essentially, when making decisions about either one of these things, factor in the other. So I know that's a lot from a high level, but are there any questions relative to the broad financial potential implications of what it might look like if you were to finance a significant capital project like this using a portion of reserves and a portion of bonding? And if I can steal that sheet, that whole packet. Just for purposes of context, we did get information. Sam reached out to PFM earlier this week to get an idea of where the current municipal bonding rates are. And if you were to borrow $30 million on a 10-year note, which you can do 20, but the general rate, you might be able to get in the 3.7% interest area, which equates to, on a 10-year note, about 21 or 22% of that overall amount you would need to pay back. The total debt service is not just the $30 million, but it's financing costs. Just think about your mortgage, right? your mortgage isn't just the amount you borrowed, it's the amount of closing costs that often get rolled in, and it's also the interest. On a $30 million borrowing over 10 years at 3.68%, essentially $6.5 million is that administrative interest, whether it's coupon rates or additional interest rates, so 21%. So that's the benefit of using reserve and having a strategic plan to spend down reserves if you're going to do it for a capital project. If you're not going to do a capital project, it allows you to have a different discussion about strategic planning relative to the vehicle registration fee. Vice Chair Dickinson, yeah.
So there was a 30 million to 10-year for 3.68. Was there any discussion about a 50 million or 40 million, or is it just this 30 million?
We didn't get that from PFM. That is
Thanks.
absolutely something we can do, is talk about what is the term that you'd want to borrow. And as it goes to the discussion when you get into the vehicle registration fee, I did reach out to a number of my colleagues. There are alternative strategies to finance highway work. There's ways to strategize to fund large capital projects, one of which we just showed you, which is a mix of reserve and borrowing versus straight borrowing. The same is true for roadway maintenance. There are a number of counties, my colleagues, that they do short-term borrowing for 1 year for their highway maintenance needs. Marathon County has historically not done that, but a 1-year term, for example, on $3 million, we did inquire of PFM on that, and you're borrowing $3 million. What you end up paying in terms of total debt service is $3,193,000, which is about a true interest cost of 4%. So that's where that $193,000 of additional borrowing comes in. So there's a lot of different ways that counties can finance various aspects of operations. Capital operations. You, of course, cannot borrow for true operations. You can't borrow for payroll. That's not a capital project. I don't know if that was more helpful or confusing. But other questions before we did go into closed session?
Supervisor Hartinger first, and then we'll go to Supervisor Seubert.
I've got a number, so.
Okay. Just wondering, is that Mosinee site, is that new Mosinee site included in these figures, or is that totally a separate $3, $4, $5 million project? Is the old site, is there any money included in that for either relocating most of that, tearing that down, selling that?
So I'll let Jim talk to in the $59 million number that Jim referenced for the project. If you were actually to borrow and really start construction in 27, probably 26, 27, the $59 million number is a conservative number. It has the contingency Jim talked about. It does also have the facility needs relative to the Mosinee shop rolled into that overall project cost. We don't have revenue, though, for if you were going to divest the West Street shop. That's, again, another question for the board. What you want to do with that West Street location. You have previously adopted a West Side master plan that has some various potential plans for that. That, of course, also takes board action to do any of them. And you can always change a plan. You don't need to move forward in that way. So we did not build in any offsets for revenues from divestment. You can't really divest the Mosinee shop because the FAA isn't allowing anything. My last conversation with Brian Griefey is that you can't do anything really with that site. It's got to remain open. Does that answer your question?
But the Mosinee site has hundreds of acres surrounding it that the county owns. So we wouldn't be looking to buy a new site, or would we use an existing site that's already there?
We would co-locate. The plan would be to take the existing Wausau main shop on West Street, and the Mosinee shop, the Mosinee site, both would no longer be utilized for highway, and instead we would have a single site, essentially, somewhere else, which we'll talk about later, that meets all of those facility needs in one. But again, you can't sell the Mosinee shop, the Mosinee Highway shop, as I understand it. The airport might have some use for it. I'm not familiar with that, but
Yeah, the land that we're on for the Mosinee site's just our shop area, so I don't know what else is all out there, but the land right where we're located, it's only 3 acres, and that's all that we have.
But there's all kinds of county land across whatever road that is. There's county property to the north of the airport. On the north side of the road, there's property on the north side of the airport right when you turn off of the highway. So, I mean, the county has what, 200 acres, if not more?
Kevin's looking right now, but yeah, there's some up there.
I do believe the $59 million,
The $59 million price tag for the new shop, that would include getting rid of the Mosinee and adding it to that facility.
and land acquisitions, site
Development.
readiness, architecture, and ultimate construction were all in that $59 million estimate.
So I guess my question is, did the FAA give us like a timeline that we had to be out of there? Or are they just basically saying that because of the operation of that shop and how it's run and their security, what's pushing us out of that building?
The last time I talked to Brian, we didn't have a time frame yet, but it's what the FAA has a new flight pattern, and nothing can beat a flight pattern. And that's right at, if you're familiar with our Mosinee shop, it's right at the end of the runway. So we are in the flight pattern.
Since they added on to that runway, now we're,
I don't even, I think it wouldn't even matter if we'd added on. They changed the amount of footage you need.
I would defer to the chair of the airport board if he knows. The last conversation I had with Brian, I also don't have like, hey, you got to be out of here by this date. It's just we were being told we need to move. They haven't kicked us out or evicted us, but it's look to move.
Yeah, and I can follow up with Brian on that, being the chair of the airport board, and Tom is on the board as well. But it's not imminent. This isn't like 6 months. You're talking a few years of this. So, and as Jim had said, Commissioner Griesbach had said, it's along the road as you would be coming in, and so it has to be moved based upon that.
Chair Gibbs has a question or comment.
Thank you. So, I mean, all of this is, the discussion is centered around, I think in the committee has had various discussions that all center around the need to replace the existing highway shop. And there's really no discussion about not replacing the highway shop. It's just a matter of what are we going to do to replace the shop? Is that correct?
I think Supervisor Lemmer is sending all sorts of signals.
Well, I guess that's what I would like, thank you, Mr. Chair, to talk about is, I look at the map of West Street and there's an empty lot next door. I don't know if we can take dibs on that to expand this campus. I just feel like with the discussion of the budget that we had in in November, I'm wondering what the appetite of that is, and maybe at first blush, it seems like it's cheaper to start on a new site somewhere else, but going long-term and then looking at, are we going to build an ice rink? How does that impact the borrowing, the debt, the graph that you had, because that's something that also has to be considered. I'm not really for an ice rink, I'll be honest about that, but I feel like we really need to be having these discussions to look at what are all the moving pieces and factor in all of those costs as well.
I don't know if there's a question there for me. The board ultimately needs to decide what it wants to do with, of course, the West Side Master Plan. If the highway department is relocated, you have the responsibility to make a decision about what to do with that property. I'll let Jim talk to, give a better explanation as to some of the drawbacks with respect to the site. Again, since I've come into administration, the direction from 2016 was find a place, go find land. In 2019 in December, I know a number of people were on the board at that time, the board had an offer to purchase before it for consideration to relocate the highway department to the north of the city of Wausau. And we asked, administration and staff asked to vote it down based on the zoning concern that Jim referenced. The challenge as a non-highway department expert with respect to that site on West Street are twofold. One, size. To your point, there is more property to the east. That is true. It's long and narrow. Circulation, and I'll let Jim talk to the drawbacks relative to the kind of configuration of the site. Second, location. This was built eons ago on the edge of town. It is no longer the edge of town. If you think about where, and a number of counties have built highway shops, and this is in no way, I'm not saying, hey, because someone else did it, you should do it. We need to make that, you need to make that decision. But where those other counties have built their shops, if you think about Shawano County, if you drive down Highway 29, you see the Shawano County Highway, one of their new highway facilities. It's right along the highway, essentially out in the middle of nowhere, not in a, what I'll call an urban area. So it's those twofold pieces. One, configuration doesn't support the current needs or future needs. And then location, it's just a bad, if you were building it today, which you're not, you have one, it's not the greatest location. But ultimately, that's a board decision. Relocating the shop does not mean you're building an ice arena in my mind. So I don't know that that's answering your question, but it's both of those things are a decision point for ultimately the board. Jim, do you have anything you want to add to the site, the current site?
Had a couple of issues with the current site is, again, there's no room for expansion. Unfortunately, none of the equipment ever gets smaller. Everything gets bigger. To fit everything in there, we would not have very good flow. Ultimately, we'd probably have to have a couple of the driveways come out right next to the railroad tracks or on 17th Street. Quick Trip, which we love very much at noontime and before we go to work for donuts and lunch. Otherwise, it does cause us a lot of issues with the traffic. We're trying to get large pieces of equipment with large trailers out of there. There's times people sit there for a few minutes before we can get out. I've noticed over the years, probably due to Quick Trip and the build of that area, the sidewalks are starting to get more and more populated. People pulling out of their driveway, I'm afraid at one point we're going to hit somebody cruising on that road. I've got myself ready coming out and people are cruising that sidewalk at a pretty great rate of speed. And at some point, somebody's going to get clipped. And again, the configuration for us to get in, even expanding to the farther to the east, we have no decent flow. We just cannot operate in that area. And another big thing that it'd be a temporary issue, but the constructability of this, we would probably almost have to find a temporary place for a year and a half or 2 years for construction, because talking to the architect and also to Myron, they both had head scratching going on of how we could stay on this site during construction. And I just don't see any viable way that we could actually stay operating on this site while we're building.
I want to bring the discussion back to where we're currently at on the agenda, which is overview of highway fund balance and potential funding strategies for design and construction costs. Obviously, I think what we're getting into now is going to be our next agenda item. Does anybody have anything further on this specific item? Go ahead, Supervisor Poole.
Yeah, just looking to drive the debt service down. And if we do go with the new facility, it looks like 2032 would be the optimal time to start borrowing. What would be the cost of delaying from 2027 to 2032?
Well, I don't know the cost of delaying. I think to your point that you want the debt service to hit in 2032. I don't know that that necessarily means you want to delay borrowing. That's a conversation we would have with our professional finance advisors to talk about when do you issue the debt, when do the various pieces hit. You can delay what that service looks like. You can structure that differently. But to your point, yes, the operative time to service it, you want to service it in a way, I would think, you'd want to service it in a way, structure it in a way so that you have, rather than the rate go significantly up and level off and then drop, you want to try to, as you often hear from other municipal borrowing and school referendums, they really try to schedule the various debt issuances to maintain that a more consistent rate. I think you're spot on.
And for cost, I was thinking more how much it would cost for maintenance for the new facility or for the old facility. Then, obviously needs upkeep, maybe needs some upgrades or something like that. What cost would be associated with that? Maybe if we could get that information before the board would vote on this in whole, maybe that would be good. If that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly. And I'll let Jim talk to it. I think talk to some of that. The challenge is it is comparing a bit of apples to oranges in terms of what you would do on the existing site if the decision were to stay there versus what you would build if you had that green site without constraints relative to flow and function. But I don't know, Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the maintenance that the highway department has been putting off? It's certainly, I mean, the $50+ million mark to stay at the highway department, you wouldn't, on the current West Street spot, you wouldn't spend that if you're going to stay, because you're not going to rebuild everything there. It's for purposes of a comparison to set you up for what it would look like to have to get as comparable as sites as you could get. But we'd make it work. It's going to be millions to do a lot of that ongoing operational upkeep. You'll have to also figure out an answer to the Mosinee side, which is in that probably $5 to $7 million range. But it's a fundamentally different conversation. And you got the board, kudos to you, the responsibility you have to balance. Is this a future long-term generation decision, or do you stay with what you got? The board has gone both ways. You go back 10 years and we had a lot of projects that we did put off. And I'm not saying good or bad. The decision was intentionally made to delay some of those projects. Board over the last 6 years has said, hey, we need to address a lot of these issues. It's a policy decision for you.
Supervisor
Chair.
Freiberg.
Thank you. I guess I've got two questions. I'm going to go back to Supervisor Dickinson's question in the beginning. What factor does that wheel tax play into this? If there is a wheel tax or if there is no wheel tax? Second question is, do we need the Mosinee facility? If that's their $5, $6, $7 million facility, do we need that facility? Because now it's only used in winter, correct? 3 months?
Getting in the winter, probably closer to 4 to 5. It all depends on what you want for level of service. Without that Mosinee facility, for us to get down to the county line, we would definitely see a drop of a level of service, just because of the miles it takes to drive from Wausau down to the county line.
Okay.
On your first question on the impact between the decision here and vehicle registration fee, again, this is not going to be a helpful answer, but I think it depends. It allows you a different strategic decision. I think the way that the agenda is structured is to develop the strategy. What additional information do you need? If you're not going to pursue a relocation of the highway facility, and what that leads to is really, what is your plan with the significant balance above the remaining unassigned on the document that I handed out? You can develop a strategy for what that means. You can, does it allow you to pursue other highway department projects that you want to do and develop a plan to spend that down? Alternatively, do you want to look at a change to the vehicle registration fee or an abolishment of the vehicle registration fee? Just simple math. If you're going to use $30 million for a highway department, and then you decide, never mind, not going to do that. You have $30 million. Your wheel tax is netting about $3 million a year. It gives you a spend down period where you could say, hey, we don't need it. However, what then is the plan to fill that gap when that time period passes? Because the other piece I know the infrastructure committee has done a lot of work on this. The needs of our roadway system from a perspective of maintenance under the 2050 plan, you don't have enough funding. The thing that has really helped us over the last several years, first of all the money that's come in from the state, which is also Rescue Plan Act money, federally allocated money to the states to do projects. We've received a lot of that. But then our own allocation of American Rescue Plan Act funds allowed us to do fund a lot of capital projects with American Rescue Plan Act funds that then freed up otherwise existing capital dollars for highway. So I know this isn't a helpful answer, but it depends. What do you want to accomplish with your strategy? A strategy is the important piece. Regardless of which direction you go relative to the highway shop, develop a strategy. If the highway shop is part of that strategy, it certainly, I think, is an operative factor in what you do with respect to the vehicle registration fee, but we can get into later in the agenda. Certainly there are differences of how you finance things from a county as a county government. There are who you're collecting from is different, vehicle registration fee versus property tax or borrowing, and the cost is different.
I want to kind of follow up on that wheel tax. Don't you think, I'm going to go back to Supervisor, that's where we should start? Without that $3 million, I'm not sure what the exact figure is, but without that blacktopping money has got to come someplace else. So where is that? Are we going to put that in a tax roll? Are we going to take it out of reserves? If we knew, I mean, we can talk about this figure and that figure and that figure, and if we don't know what that figure is, how can we move forward? If we don't know what's going to happen to that wheel tax, and the people talking to me about the wheel tax on the board, that's going to get voted down. And if that happens, what's going to happen? Where is that money going to come from? Is the tax rate going to go up? There's way too many questions without knowing what's going to happen with that wheel tax. Thank you.
Chair Gibbs.
Well, I think, the discussion about the removal of the wheel tax or the registration fee and the elimination of that $3 million revenue stream that comes in that is used for operations, well, in blacktopping, the only way that you replace that, because you can't just put it on operations, because the levy limits prohibit that. Well, what you could put it on is debt service, but that then comes at an increased cost in financing. As it was alluded to by the administrator, at a 4% interest rate, even on a short-term one-year borrowing, it adds $193,000 cost to it versus the 3 cents per $25 or which is, the $193,000 is 4% cost to the taxpayer to get that $3 million. And versus costing 0.012% on the registration fee. So if we want to talk about being fiscally conservative and respectful of the taxpayer, I think we have to look at that also. But one other thing that I think needs to be considered is delaying, because what I hear from everyone is, and we've heard and we've talked about this highway shop now going on, 8 years, almost 10 years. And it's always centered around, we're going to replace that highway shop because the need is there. The efficiencies are not in the current format area. The challenges with the current site. I've heard from this committee, the infrastructure committee at least, that they've always considered moving forward with a new highway shop at some point. The question then becomes, is it going to be current or current location or a new location? And so then if we delay, there's increased costs as construction costs continue to rise down the road. So all of those factors are something that needs to be considered. But we need to also look at how are we, because I think this committee has really said we're going to do a highway shop at some point. It's just a matter of when. And so I think, to the administrator's point of the financing, is now you can do that so constructively that it minimizes the impact on the debt levy, and it can hit at the time. We don't necessarily have to delay moving forward with the project, because alone you've got design is going to be a year and a half, acquisition of land, if we're going to move to that part, is going to be another section. So I think the approach needs to be well thought out.
Jasper.
Thank you, Chair Gibbs. Actually, you made a couple of points that I was going to talk about here. So we've got an estimate, and it looks like at first we were doing a multi-department type of building, but zoning kind of ran in the way of that, and then we're going straight highway. And we got numbers from 2016, which I'm guessing you guys have kind of ballparked the last 8 years of inflation and market costs and everything else up into that, but we really don't know what the costs are, as far as I can tell, because we have a couple different options here. We have a couple different sites. We have a couple different, whether or not we're building or remodeling, and I completely agree. You never know what you're going to get into with remodeling. But what would help is a cost benefit to this. And if we're going to share with other departments, what are their costs in this? And it doesn't sound like that's really that feasible, but for me to understand and try to make a decision on this, I've got to take a look at where we're at currently, what it costs us to operate there, the space that we need versus where we want to go and what that's going to do for us and what impact that's going to have. But we're looking at several sites, and it's difficult for us to say it's going to cost $60 million because we don't know that yet, right?
Well, I think you make a good point. We really never know what a project is going to cost until we bid it, and then we get the bids back. But we have updated the cost. Jim has been working since 2016. We've had a couple of cost estimators, not only our architecture, but Myron has run the cost. So that $59 million project amount for a project that would begin construction is like 26. The 2025 or 2024 cost estimate is 55.6. But to your point, things cost more as you put it off. With the inflation factors from our cost estimators, that gets us to 2026 dollars of about 58.9 million. So you're at that 59 million for the highway only shop. To your point about the combined multi-department estimate, that is up on your screen right now. It's on page 20 of the packet. You're absolutely right. The project has swayed since 2016, where it was a different group of departments. Through the county's kind of master facility planning over the last several years, primarily your Lakeview projects, there's no longer a need to relocate emergency management. You'll see on the top left of the slide. They no longer need to go there. Not that they were big in the first place. They were a very, very small component. It's a staff of 2. But Parks, Rec, and Forestry if you were going to relocate them along with highway, that takes that cost up over that $80 million to the 85 million. It also puts other constraints on you. Because the Parks Department delivers services for the city of Wausau, you're really restricting geographically where you could locate that multi-department building. So I think I said it, whether it was infrastructure or HR finance at a previous meeting, it reminds me of the Heinz commercial, best things come to those who wait. This has taken a long time. One of the positives is emergency management is off the list, conservation planning and zoning is off the list, sheriff's office maintenance is no longer necessary, and parks, we have a plan for where they can be located off of River Drive that doesn't need to have them go with highway. Similarly, the city of Wausau came back and said, you know what, there's really not significant benefit to having the city of Wausau Public Works share facilities for us. So what that does is it geographically opens up the idea of where could you locate a highway-only shop? And it can be beyond really the city of Wausau proper. You'll recall in 2019, in December, the piece of property that was being evaluated was literally on the border with the city of Wausau and the village of Maine. That's where we had the zoning issue. The need to be that immediately close to the city of Wausau goes away with the lack of consolidation of departments. That said, if you think about all the highway shops, including the Mosinee shop, you want to, and we'll talk about it, I think, in closed session, there's opportunities to locate it in a place that is kind of more intentional with the Mosinee shop needs, the long-term needs that Vice Chair Dickinson referenced, as well as your Wausau needs if you're going to relocate. But you're absolutely right. We never know we put out the Regional Forensic Science Center bids. They initially came in significantly higher, and we had to work to get those down. We've had projects. I much prefer when the projects come in under budget. But we really never know what something's going to cost. We can have really good estimates, what we think, and Jim's done a lot of the estimates with Myron and Barrientos. But once we bid it is when we figure out what it's going to cost.
No, and I'm glad to see that you did the traffic study on a couple of those too, because that's going to impact that area, having those trucks coming in and out of there on the south side of Marathon with that quick trip and the schools and everything else around there. That worries me too. So I'm glad that's something you guys have taken into consideration. It's just it's difficult for me to wrap my head around this many options without really seeing a lot more of the detail with it, I guess. And I know you guys have done your homework. It's just I'm trying to wrap my head around it.
Supervisor Dickinson?
Thank you. My only comment is, as we're talking about this funding, fiscally conservative is not taking $3 million a year and putting it into a reserve of unused funds to build up a $30 million cash, bag that you then decide you're going to use it for something that it was never intended to be used for. So when we talk about our funding, I think it's very critical, and this is the discussion, and like I said, why I think we should have had the vehicle registration fee discussion first, which really was the intent, regardless of what some want to talk about. You have to look at what these fundings are going to be. You have to look at if it's going to be, well, what's the rate for 30 million? Well, what's the rate for 50 million? What's the rate for 40 million? What's the rate for 20 million? We have none of that. So, I mean, it's nice that we are, dipping our toe in the water at this particular moment. But in order to make a decision on any of these items that come up next, we have to have a better understanding of what the costs will be in regard to the funding structure. Thank you.
Well, we're about an hour into the meeting here. We've got one agenda item down. We've got about another hour before the EDC meeting starts. So if anybody has anything against it, but I'd like to move on to our next item, which is closed session. If we're ready, I'd take someone to read the motion for closed session from infrastructure.
No motion.
Need it read out, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Apologize. Motion to go into closed session pursuant Wisconsin Stat 19.85, parent 1, parent E, for the purpose of deliberating or negotiating the purchase and sale of properties and conducting other specific public businesses. whenever competitive or bargaining reasons require a closed session, to wit, update and discussion regarding purchase of property for possible future county facility building site.
We have a motion from Supervisor Huttinger. Do we have a second from Infrastructure? We have a second from Soibert. We get a roll call vote, please?
Supervisor Pfeiffer,
Yes.
Supervisor Dickinson, Supervisor Gisselman, Supervisor Hardinger, Supervisor Soibert, Supervisor Vole.
Yes.
All right, we have a 6-1 vote, I believe. We'll turn it over to Human Resources and Finance.
Do I have a similar motion from Finance? You'll need to read it out. Supervisor Lemmer.
Sorry, I have to get it up on my screen. I make a motion to go into closed session, roll call vote required pursuant to Wisconsin State Statute 19.85 sub 1 sub E for the purpose of deliberating or negotiating the purchase and sale of properties or conducting other specified public business whenever competitive or bargaining reasons require a closed session, specifically update and discussion regarding purchase of property for a possible future county facility building site.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Poole. Roll call will be taken.
Supervisor Robinson,
Aye.
Supervisor Gibbs,
He cannot participate in the closed sessions.
Supervisor Hart, Supervisor Lemmer, Supervisor Poole,
That motion carries. We will go into closed session, and consistent with the board policy, you need to be present to participate in the executive session.
Chair Gibbs, I'll move you to the lobby.
Thank you.
We are.
I don't understand how you can have a budget without knowing what you're building. I know, Jerry. I won.